The bright neon lights of Kepler Station's biggest bar painted strange colors across the faces of dozens of different alien creatures. It was the evening rush hour, and the place was packed with travelers from across the galaxy. Captain Jake Miller sat in a quiet corner with his crew, slowly drinking his synthetic alcohol while watching the crowd. His ship had docked here just 2 hours ago for refueling, and his team needed a break after 3 weeks in deep space. The bar was like a zoo of different species. The Vorthok warriors took up most of the center area with their huge reptile-like bodies. These guys were 8 feet tall, covered in thick scales, and had teeth that could bite through metal. They were famous across the galaxy as the toughest fighters anyone had ever seen. Near the windows, a group of Zephyrians sat making musical sounds to each other. These crystal people looked like walking diamonds and could move faster than the eye could follow. Jake's crew was small but reliable. Tom Brooks, his chief engineer, was a quiet guy from Texas who could fix anything that broke. Lisa Ward, their pilot, came from London and could fly through an asteroid field blindfolded. David Chen handled their cargo and weapons systems, while Emma Thompson took care of communications and navigation. They were all good people, and Jake trusted them with his life. "Look at the little mammals," said Krax, the biggest Vorthok in the place. His voice was loud and rough, like rocks grinding. Together, he wanted everyone to hear him, especially the humans, playing soldier in their cute little uniforms. The other Vorthok warriors made hissing sounds that passed for laughter among their kind. They found humans amusing in the way people might find a small dog trying to act tough. Humans had only joined the galactic community 3 years ago, and their reputation was not impressive. Most aliens saw them as weak creatures who got emotional and made a lot of noise, but never actually did anything dangerous. Every species in the galaxy had heard stories about human aggression. Usually, it went like this. Humans would get upset about something, start yelling and making threats, wave their arms around, and then back down when faced with real opposition. The Vorthok had a saying that translated roughly to loud bark, no bite, and they used it specifically when talking about humans. Tom shifted in his seat and looked nervous. The young engineer had grown up on a peaceful farming colony and didn't like confrontation. "Maybe we should head back to the ship, Captain," he said quietly, glancing at the Vorthok table. "We've got that early departure tomorrow anyway." Jake took another slow sip of his drink and shook his head. "Not yet," he said calmly. He had heard insults like this on every station, every planet, and every trading post they had visited. After 3 years of traveling the galaxy, he was used to being treated like a harmless pet. Let them have their fun. We're not bothering anyone. The truth was, Jake Miller had served 20 years in the Earth Defense Force before becoming a merchant captain. So had most of his crew. When Earth joined the galactic community, they quickly realized that military veterans made the best deep space traders. They were disciplined, could handle stress, and knew how to work as a team. What the aliens didn't understand was that nearly every human ship in space was crewed by former soldiers. Lisa Ward sipped her drink and watched the Vorthok table with careful eyes. She had been a fighter pilot before becoming a cargo hauler, and she still had the instincts. "They're getting louder," she observed quietly. David nodded. He was keeping track of the exits and counting how many potential hostiles were in the room, old habits from his days as a security specialist. 14 Vorthok, 8 Zephyrians, about 30 other assorted species. Most of them are just here to drink, but that main group is looking for trouble. Emma, who had been monitoring local communications on her portable device, looked up with concern. "Captain, I'm picking up chatter on the security frequencies. Apparently, there was an incident last week where some Vorthok picked a fight with a human merchant crew. The humans backed down and paid a fine to avoid conflict." "Smart choice," Jake said, but there was something in his voice that his crew recognized. They had served with him long enough to know that Captain Miller's calm exterior could be deceiving. The bar continued its normal evening rhythm, but there was a tension building that the experienced humans could feel. They had learned to read alien body language over their years in space. The Vorthok were getting more aggressive with each drink, and they kept glancing over at the human table with increasing boldness. The trouble began when a six-armed Trilaxian bartender walked over to their table. These creatures looked like purple octopi that had learned to walk upright, and this one wore the official uniform of station management. His multiple eyes focused on Jake as he spoke in the universal translator's flat tone. "Humans, your docking fees have been increased," the bartender announced, holding up a digital pad. "Station management has decided that your kind requires additional security measures while on the station." Jake looked at the numbers on the screen and felt his jaw tighten. Lisa leaned over to see the amount, and her eyes went wide. "That's triple the standard rate," she protested, her British accent getting thicker, like it always did when she was upset. "We've never caused any incidents here, or anywhere else. Our record is completely clean." The Trilaxian's tentacles writhed in what might have been embarrassment. "I apologize, but the decision comes from the top level of management. There have been ... concerns about human behavior patterns." That's when Krax decided to get involved. The massive Vorthok warrior pushed himself up from his table and moved toward them with the slow, confident walk of a predator who knew he was the biggest thing in the room. His scales caught the neon lights as he approached, making him look even more intimidating. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, and when he reached their table, he cast a shadow over all of them. "Perhaps the fees are high, because everyone in the galaxy knows humans are all bark and no bite," Krax said, his voice carrying across the now quiet bar. "Your species loves to talk about war and fighting and being tough, but you always run away when there's real danger." The cantina had gone from its usual noisy chatter to almost complete silence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as aliens turned to watch what was happening. This was entertainment they had all seen before. Humans would get embarrassed, maybe argue a little, and then pay whatever was demanded before hurrying away with their tails between their legs. It was like watching a nature documentary where the small animals backed down from the large predators. Jake could feel dozens of alien eyes watching them. Some were recording with their devices, probably planning to share the video with friends later. The Vorthok at the center tables were all grinning, showing their razor-sharp teeth. Even the Crystal Zephyrians had stopped their musical conversation to observe. "We'll pay the fee," Jake said in a calm, steady voice. He reached into his jacket for his credit chip, moving slowly and deliberately. There was no anger in his voice, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. To the watching aliens, it looked like exactly what they expected from humans. Tom was staring down at the table, his face red with embarrassment. Lisa had her hands clenched into fists, but she stayed seated. David and Emma were also keeping still, though. Anyone who knew them well might have noticed they were both sitting very straight, like soldiers at attention. Krax's reptilian face twisted into what passed for a smile among his species. "Smart choice, little mammal," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's good to see that your kind knows their place in the galaxy." But then something happened that nobody expected. Instead of just enjoying his victory and walking away, Krax decided to make his point even clearer. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe he just wanted to put on a show for his friends, but he raised his massive scaled hand and casually backhanded Tom across the face. The sound of the impact was like a gunshot in the quiet bar. Tom, who weighed maybe 170 pounds compared to Krax's 400, was knocked clean out of his chair. He hit the floor hard and slid several feet before coming to a stop against another table. Blood began flowing from his nose, and he looked dazed. "Consider that a lesson in knowing your place," Krax announced to the room. The cantina erupted. Aliens of every species began making their version of laughter. The Vorthok hissed and roared with amusement. The Zephyrians created a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Even species that usually stayed neutral in conflicts were clicking and buzzing with entertainment. To them, this was the perfect ending to the show. The humans had been put in their place, and now everyone could go back to their drinks with a funny story to tell. But something was wrong. The humans weren't moving. Jake hadn't even looked down at Tom, who was still on the floor wiping blood from his face. Lisa, David, and Emma were all sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead. The laughter in the room began to fade as some of the more observant aliens noticed that the humans' reaction wasn't quite what they expected. Jake finally moved, but not to help Tom or to leave the bar. Instead, he carefully placed his credit chip back in his pocket and looked up at Cracks with the same calm expression he'd had all evening. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet and controlled. "That was a mistake," he said simply. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be recorded, analyzed, and discussed across the galaxy for decades to come. Military academies would study the footage. Alien psychologists would write papers trying to understand what they witnessed. And every species in known space would fundamentally change how they viewed humanity. Jake didn't shout or make threats like the aliens expected. He didn't pound his fist on the table or demand an apology. Instead, he simply stood up from his chair with the same calm expression he'd worn all evening. The movement was so smooth and natural that Cracks actually relaxed for a moment, thinking the human was finally going to back down properly. That's when Jake grabbed his metal chair and brought it down on the Vorthok's skull with devastating force. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Cracks, who weighed over 400 pounds and had scales tougher than body armor, actually staggered backward. His reptilian eyes went wide with shock. In his entire life as a warrior, no creature had ever moved that fast or hit him that hard without warning. He was more surprised than hurt. But the surprise quickly turned to rage. Crax's hand went to the plasma blade on his belt, the same weapon he'd used to cut down dozens of enemies across the galaxy. The energy weapon could slice through steel, and he'd never met an opponent who could survive its touch. But as his fingers closed around the handle, he discovered something that would terrify him. For the rest of his life, he never got the chance to draw it. Lisa had moved the instant Jake grabbed his chair. The former fighter pilot vaulted over their table like she was still doing military training exercises, her body moving with perfect timing and precision. Her elbow drove into Crax's throat with surgical accuracy, hitting exactly the right spot to cut off his air supply and send pain shooting through his nervous system. At the same moment, Tom was getting up from the floor. Blood was still streaming from his broken nose, but instead of looking defeated, his eyes had gone completely cold. The quiet farm boy from Texas swept Crax's legs with a move he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training, sending the massive alien crashing to the ground like a falling tree. Before Crax even hit the floor, all three humans were on top of him. But this wasn't the wild, emotional fighting that aliens associated with humans. This was something entirely different. Their movements were coordinated, efficient, and absolutely ruthless. Jake targeted the nerve clusters in the Vorthak's arms to disable his weapon-drawing ability. Lisa worked on pressure points that would cause maximum pain and confusion. Tom, despite his injuries, methodically attacked joint connections to limit the aliens' mobility. The watching crowd began to understand they weren't seeing human emotion or desperation. They were watching human military training in action. Crack's companions at the center tables jumped up to help their leader, but they found themselves facing David and Emma, who had moved into position without anyone noticing. David grabbed a heavy serving tray and used it like a shield while advancing. On the nearest Vorthak, Emma had picked up a broken bottle and was holding it like someone who knew exactly how to use improvised weapons. The humans fought like a pack of wolves, each one covering the other's backs and communicating without words. When one of them engaged an opponent, the others would immediately adjust their positions to prevent flanking attacks. They used chairs, bottles, and anything else they could grab as weapons. But more importantly, they used them effectively. The Vorthok warriors, who had won battles across a dozen worlds, found themselves completely outmatched. These weren't desperate animals fighting for survival. These were soldiers who had trained together, fought together, and trusted each other completely. Every move was calculated to cause maximum damage, while minimizing risk to their teammates. The other aliens in the cantina began backing away in genuine fear. They had expected to see the usual human drama, followed by a quick surrender. Instead, they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about Earth's species. The humans weren't fighting like emotional creatures driven by anger or fear. They were fighting like predators who had been pretending to be prey. Cracks pinned beneath Jake's knee, with Lisa controlling his breathing and Tom systematically disabling his ability to fight back. Finally understood the truth that would soon spread across the galaxy. Humans hadn't been showing aggression for the past 3 years. They had been showing restraint. The difference was more terrifying than any alien could have imagined. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time it was over, 5 of the galaxy's most feared warriors were on the ground, and the humans were barely breathing hard. The heavy blast doors of the cantina slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and station security poured in wearing full combat armor. They had expected to find the usual aftermath of a bar fight: broken furniture, some minor injuries, and everyone involved trying to explain why it wasn't their fault. Instead, they walked into a scene that would be talked about in security briefings for years to come. 5 Vorthok warriors, each one a legendary fighter who had conquered battlefields across the galaxy, were scattered across the floor like broken toys. 2 were completely unconscious, their massive bodies motionless except for the slow rise and fall of their breathing. The other 3 were awake but groaning in pain, clutching various parts of their anatomy, and making sounds that no one had ever heard from Vorthok before. It sounded almost like whimpering. Standing in the middle of the destruction were 5 humans, positioned in a defensive formation that any military expert would recognize as textbook small unit tactics. They weren't celebrating or cheering like most species did after winning a fight. Instead, they stood quietly alert, scanning the room for additional threats. Their clothes were torn, and they had some cuts and bruises, but they looked like they could fight another 5 rounds without breaking a sweat. The cantina itself was dead silent, except for the steady drip, drip, drip of alien blood falling from overturned tables onto the floor. Every other patron in the bar was pressed against the walls, staring at the humans like they had just witnessed something impossible. Security Chief Vexstar entered last, his 10-foot frame filling the doorway. He belonged to a species called the Montari, insect-like creatures with compound eyes and razor-sharp limbs that could slice through metal. Even among aliens who were used to violence, Vexstar had a reputation as someone you didn't want to mess with. His voice buzzed with authority when he spoke. "Stand down," he ordered, his multiple eyes focusing on each human individually. "All of you. This incident is over." Jake looked up at the towering security chief and calmly wiped blood from his knuckles with a bar napkin. None of it was his own blood. "We're done here," he said in the same steady voice he'd used all evening. There was no anger, no excitement. Just a simple statement of fact. Lisa, David, Tom, and Emma remained in their defensive positions until Jake gave them a small nod. Only then did they relax their stance. But even their relaxed posture looked more military than civilian. The medical team rushed in behind security, carrying emergency equipment designed to treat a dozen different alien physiologies. As they began working on the injured Vorthok, hushed conversations started spreading through the crowd of witnesses. Aliens who had been recording the fight were frantically uploading their footage to the Galactic Communication Network, adding comments in dozens of languages. On the far side of the cantina, an ancient Zephyrian scholar sat in his booth, his crystalline body flickering with different colors as his emotions changed. Crystalline Sung Vages had lived for over 3,000 years and had studied warfare among dozens of species. He was considered one of the galaxy's foremost experts on military tactics and combat psychology. As he watched the recorded footage on his personal device, playing it back in slow motion to analyze every movement, his crystal structure began glowing brighter. By the ancient stars, he whispered to his companion, a younger Zephyrian, who served as his research assistant. We've been completely wrong about them. This entire time, we've been watching them wrong. His assistant's crystals chimed with confusion. What do you mean, honored teacher? The old scholar replayed the footage again, focusing on the moment when Jake first moved. Look at the precision. Look at the coordination. Look at how they fought together without saying a word to each other. This wasn't aggression like we understand it. This wasn't emotional violence or desperate survival instincts. He paused the recording at the moment when all 5 humans had positioned themselves in perfect defensive formation after the fight ended. This was restraint being lifted. For 3 years, we've been watching them hold back, and we mistook it for weakness. The younger Zephyrian structure flickered with disbelief. But teacher, they're mammals. They're small and soft and emotional. How could they be more dangerous than Vorthok warriors? Crystalline Song of Ages began uploading his own analysis to the Galactic Academic Network, his ancient fingers moving quickly across his device, because we judged them by our own standards, instead of understanding what they actually are. Every interaction we've had with humans, every time we've seen them back down from a fight or pay unfair prices, or accept insults, we thought it was because they were afraid. The footage began spreading across the galaxy at light speed, transmitted through the quantum communication networks that connected every civilized world. Military commanders, government leaders, and xenobiologists on hundreds of planets stopped what they were doing to watch the recording of 5 humans dismantling 5 Vorthok warriors in less than 2 minutes. On the Vorthok homeworld, Supreme War Leader Cracksmoth watched the footage 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of the Military Council. On Zephyria Prime, the Crystal Council gathered to discuss the implications of what they were seeing. Even on distant worlds that had barely heard of humans, the footage was being analyzed by experts who were all reaching the same terrifying conclusion. The galaxy had been living alongside apex predators who had simply chosen not to hunt. Within 6 hours of the bar fight, the footage had been viewed by over 2 billion sentient beings across known space. Military academies began emergency curriculum reviews. Diplomatic corps started drafting new protocols for human contact. And somewhere in the depths of space, alien commanders began wondering what other assumptions they had made about the small, quiet species from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called for the first time in over 200 years. The massive chamber on Nexus Prime, the neutral world where all major galactic decisions were made, hadn't seen this much activity since the last great war between the Zephyrian Empire and the Trilaxian Republic. Representatives from 47 different species had dropped everything and traveled across the galaxy in just 3 days. All because of a 2-minute bar fight. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the vastly different physical needs of dozens of alien species. The Vorthok delegation sat in reinforced chairs that could support their massive weight, while the gas-breathing Nebulans occupied sealed atmospheric pods. The crystalline Zephyrians had their own section with specialized lighting, and the aquatic depths dwellers attended via a holographic projection from their water-filled ships in orbit. At the center of it all was the speaking platform, where representatives could address the entire assembly. The tension in the room was unlike anything most of these beings had ever experienced. For 3 years, humans had been the galaxy's newest and least threatening members. Now, everything had changed. Ambassador Thexelon of the Vorthok hegemony was the first to speak. He was smaller than the warriors who had been in the bar fight, but his voice carried the authority of someone who spoke for billions of his species. However, there was something different in his tone today, something that the other delegates noticed immediately. The usual arrogance that marked Vorthok diplomatic communications was gone, replaced by what sounded almost like uncertainty. Honorable members of the council, he began, his reptilian features tense with controlled anger. We are here to address the unprovoked and savage attack on Vorthok citizens by human aggressors. We demand immediate reparations for the medical costs, the damage to our reputation as warriors, and the psychological trauma inflicted on our people. A murmur went through the chamber. The idea of Vorthok warriors suffering psychological trauma was so unusual that some species weren't sure they had heard correctly through their translators. Human. Ambassador Robert Harrison stood up in the human section of the chamber. He was a career diplomat who had spent decades in government service before humanity even knew aliens existed. His appearance was deliberately unremarkable, average height, graying hair, and the kind of calm demeanor that made people comfortable. But after watching the bar fight footage, every alien in the chamber was looking at him with new eyes, unprovoked. Harrison replied, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. Your warrior struck our crew member first, causing injury and drawing blood. According to galactic law and basic self-defense principles, we defended ourselves within appropriate bounds. Appropriate bounds. Vexolan's voice rose to a hiss that echoed off the chamber walls. Your people nearly killed 5 trained warriors. That was not defense, Ambassador. That was something else entirely. That was a demonstration of capabilities that your species has kept hidden from the galactic community. The chamber erupted in a dozen different languages as representatives began talking among themselves. Some species made clicking sounds, others hummed, and a few communicated through color changes in their skin or crystal structures. The noise was tremendous until the council speaker, an ancient being from the first species to achieve interstellar travel, called for order. That's when crystalline song Vages rose from the Zephyrian section. His 3,000-year lifespan gave him more authority than almost anyone else in the chamber, and when he spoke, everyone listened. His crystalline form chimed softly as he moved, creating a sound that was somehow both beautiful and ominous. Honored colleagues, he began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of study and observation. I have spent the last 3 days analyzing every piece of footage from the incident. I have consulted with military experts from 17 different species, reviewed historical combat data, and examined psychological profiles. What we witnessed was not unusual human behavior reacting to stress or threat. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the revelation that would change everything. What we witnessed was human military conditioning in action. Those 5 individuals were not civilian merchants or traders as we assumed. They were soldiers. Highly trained, experienced soldiers who have been pretending to be something else. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the species that communicated through movement or color changes went still. Every human ship we have encountered in 3 years, every human delegation we have met with, every human trader, or explorer, or diplomat, we have dismissed as weak and harmless. They have all had military training. We have not been dealing with a peaceful species that occasionally produces warriors. We have been dealing with a warrior species that has been choosing to act peaceful. The implications hit different species at different speeds, but the result was the same everywhere in the chamber. Fear, real, genuine fear from creatures who had thought themselves at the top of the galactic food chain. At that moment, the chamber doors opened and Admiral Patricia Hayes of the human colonial fleet entered. She wore a crisp dress, uniform covered in ribbons and decorations that most aliens couldn't interpret but somehow looked impressive anyway. Her bearing was unmistakably military, from the way she walked to the way she held her shoulders. Every step she took seemed to confirm what the old Zephyrian scholar had just revealed. She approached the speaking platform without asking permission, and somehow no one tried to stop her. "Honorable delegates," Hayes began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of absolute confidence. "Humanity appreciates your concern about recent events. For the past 3 years, we have been working very hard to integrate peacefully into galactic society. We hoped that our full capabilities would never become necessary to discuss." The Trilaxian representative, his 6 arms trembling slightly, managed to ask the question that everyone was thinking. "And now, Admiral, what happens now that we know?" Hayes smiled, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than any threat could have been. "Now you know the truth," she replied simply. "We trust that this knowledge will help prevent future misunderstandings. Humanity seeks peace, prosperity, and friendship with all species. But we want you to understand that we are prepared for alternatives if peace becomes impossible." The silence that followed her words would last for several minutes. When the session finally resumed, every species representative was thinking the same thing. The galactic balance of power had just shifted forever because of a bar fight that lasted 2 minutes. Nothing would ever be the same.